The couple walked into the upscale restaurant with an air of entitlement that seemed to precede them like a shadow. From the way they carried themselves, it was evident they believed the world owed them special treatment. They bypassed the line of patrons waiting to be seated, ignoring the maitres d' polite attempts to guide them toward an available table. Instead, their eyes fell upon a particular corner table draped in fine linens, adorned with the most exquisite settings, and clearly prepared with extra attention. It was not just any table. It was the kind of spot reserved for someone who carried weight in society, someone who wasn't just a guest but a part of the establishment's soul. Without hesitation, they walked over, pulled out the chairs, and made themselves comfortable as though the table was theirs by right. Patrons nearby exchanged curious glances, some whispering quietly, aware that the table was not meant for just anyone. The staff hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, and the manager discreetly tried to signal to the couple. But they brushed off the attempt as though mere employees had no authority over them there. Entitlement was not born of wealth but of arrogance. They spoke loudly, waved down servers with the snap of a finger, and ordered the most expensive items on the menu as though flaunting what little they had. To them, the table was just a prop in their performance of superiority. They didn't notice the way the atmosphere shifted, how conversations around them grew quieter, and how eyes subtly turned toward the entrance when a tall, sharply dressed man entered. He carried no visible display of wealth beyond his tailored suit and understated watch, yet his presence radiated the kind of confidence that needed no embellishment. His stride was calm, deliberate, and each step seemed to command respect without demand. The staff's demeanor changed instantly, their posture straighter, their tone more respectful. The regular patrons recognized him immediately, though the couple remained oblivious. They were too busy enjoying their assumed throne, basking in the illusion of privilege. The man paused briefly at the sight of the couple at his reserved table. A flicker of amusement crossed his face, not anger, not even annoyance, but the kind of smile worn by someone who has seen pretenders countless times before. He did not storm over or call for staff to correct the situation. Instead, he allowed silence to build around him. The kind of silence that does not need to be imposed but simply happens when true authority enters a room. People stopped mid-conversation, forks hovered just above plates, and even the waiters froze momentarily, waiting for the cue. The couple, slowly realizing the shift, looked around in confusion. Their voices no longer filled the room. Their arrogance was no longer buoyed by attention. Instead, they found themselves in the center of a spotlight they had not sought but could not escape. The man walked forward, each step measured, until he stood directly beside their table. There was no aggression in his tone, no insult, no demand for them to vacate. Instead, he simply placed a hand on the chair, glanced at the pristine setting they had disturbed, and with a calm voice said, "I own this place." The words were neither loud nor sharp, yet they carried more weight than any display of status the couple could muster. In that moment, their pretense collapsed. The man didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to remind anyone of his wealth or accomplishments. The authority of ownership spoke for him. It was the kind of statement that revealed truth without embellishment, cutting through arrogance with effortless precision. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound but the presence of realization. Everyone in the restaurant understood the power dynamic had shifted entirely. What the couple thought was theirs by assumption was in fact the stage on which they had unwittingly embarrassed themselves. The couple's expressions faltered. The confidence that once stripped from every word and gesture drained away in an instant. Their hands fidgeted with the napkins. Their eyes darted around the room searching for an ally, but there were none. The very patrons they had dismissed with condescending glances were now watching with subtle satisfaction. The staff, once hesitant, now stood with renewed assurance behind the man whose authority was unquestionable. The couple realized too late that entitlement without substance is a fragile mask, easily shattered when faced with true power. They had mistaken arrogance for influence, forgetting that real influence never needs to announce itself with noise or pretense. The billionaire had not needed to boast about his status, nor flaunt his wealth with flashy displays. His quiet declaration carried more gravity than any performance could. In that silence, the contrast between the couple's hollow pride and the man's undeniable ownership was laid bare for all to see. And the lesson lingered heavy in the air, felt by everyone who witnessed it. The billionaire's response was not a display of anger, or a desire to embarrass the couple, but rather an exercise in calm authority. When he uttered the words that revealed his ownership, there was no need for theatrics or raised tones. It was the kind of response that cut through the noise of entitlement with the sharpness of quiet confidence. The power of that moment did not come from volume but from the undeniable truth carried in his statement. In life, genuine authority does not need to shout, and true influence does not require exaggeration. His words carried weight precisely because they were spoken with composure, the kind of composure that comes from someone who has nothing to prove. The billionaire understood that real power rests not in trying to dominate others through force but in standing so firmly in one's own position that others have no choice but to recognize it. The impact of his response was immediate and profound. The restaurant, which had moments earlier been filled with the chatter of conversations and the clinking of cutlery, fell into a silence that seemed almost sacred. The weight of his words rippled through the air, altering the atmosphere in an instant. The staff who had been uncertain how to address the situation now stood taller, reassured by his presence and the clarity he brought. Patrons who had watched the scene unfold realized they were witnessing something more significant than a dispute over a table. They were seeing the contrast between arrogance and quiet authority play out in real time. The couple who moments before carried themselves with smugness now sat frozen, their faces betraying the shock of having their imagined superiority stripped away with a single sentence. What made the billionaire's response so powerful was not just what he said, but how he said it. His calmness stood in stark opposition to the couple's earlier behavior. They had relied on loud voices, dismissive gestures, and ostentatious displays to assert their importance. Yet in the end, all of it crumbled in the face of a few words spoken with effortless confidence. There is something profoundly disarming about someone who can assert dominance without aggression, who can reveal their position without arrogance. His response illuminated the difference between people who seek validation through noise and those who embody such self-assurance that validation becomes irrelevant. The silence that followed his statement was not one of awkwardness but of collective recognition, that they were in the presence of someone whose authority was unshakable. The couple's discomfort grew with every passing second of that silence. They began to fumble with their napkins, avoiding eye contact, their earlier bravado slipping away like sand through open fingers. They had believed that taking the table was a bold move that elevated their status in the eyes of others. But in reality, it only exposed their need for validation. The billionaire, on the other hand, required nothing from anyone in that room. He didn't need to remind anyone of who he was because his identity carried itself. His calm response not only humbled the couple, but also revealed the emptiness of their actions. In the presence of genuine authority, pretension always looks smaller, and arrogance always seems more desperate for the people watching. The moment became an unspoken lesson. It reminded them that power does not always manifest in loudness or spectacle. The most influential individuals often carry themselves with quiet strength, rooted in the knowledge of who they are and what they have achieved. The billionaire's words carried an aura that could not be bought or faked, and it was this authenticity that silenced the entire room. Even those who had not been directly involved felt the gravity of the moment. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken understanding that arrogance had been dismantled not through confrontation but through composure. That is why the silence felt so heavy. It was filled with realization, reflection, and the undeniable presence of true authority as the billionaire stood by his table. His demeanor remained calm, his body language relaxed, his expression unreadable yet commanding. He didn't gloat, he didn't sneer, and he didn't seek applause from the onlookers. His words were not meant to humiliate but to clarify. In one sentence, he had established the truth of the situation without descending to the level of those who had tried to usurp his place. This lack of malice only deepened the impact of his statement. Those who watched understood that his silence after speaking was as powerful as the words themselves. It allowed the couple to sit in their own discomfort, to feel the full weight of their actions without the distraction of further scolding or lecturing. The couple's arrogance had met its match, not in a louder voice, but in a voice that carried real substance. They had sought recognition through bravado, but the billionaire demonstrated that true recognition comes from authenticity, not performance. The stillness of the room became a mirror, reflecting their misplaced confidence back at them. Every second stretched longer, their sense of superiority shrinking as the reality of the situation became undeniable. In that silence, they weren't just facing the billionaire's authority, they were confronting the hollowness of their own pretension. The contrast between his calm ownership and their desperate arrogance painted a vivid picture of what real power looks like versus what counterfeit power pretends to be. This moment lingered long after it passed, etched into the memories of everyone present. It wasn't the kind of scene people would quickly forget, because it revealed something universal about human behavior and authority. The billionaires.com response reminded everyone that strength is not always about dominance, and authority is not always about control. Sometimes, the most powerful response is the one delivered with quiet certainty, a reminder that true influence doesn't require explanation. It was a moment that reduced arrogance to silence and elevated composure to its rightful place, leaving the room in awe of how much power could be carried in a single, measured statement. The silence that followed his words was unlike any ordinary pause in a conversation. It was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, an unspoken understanding that reverberated across the room. In that moment, the clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations froze mid-sentence and every eye was drawn toward the table where the couple sat across from the man who had just revealed himself. The contrast between the arrogance they had displayed and the quiet authority he carried became impossible to ignore. The couple, who had earlier basked in their imagined importance, suddenly found themselves diminished, their bravado collapsing under the weight of reality. It was as if the entire room had shifted its gaze, not out of curiosity but out of respect. And that respect was not directed at them, but at the man who needed no introduction beyond those simple words. The power of silence lies in its ability to amplify meaning, and here, it spoke volumes. No one needed to add to what had been said, because the truth of ownership had already settled over the room like a heavy curtain. The patrons who had been watching recognized that they had witnessed a reversal, a moment when false confidence was exposed for what it truly was. The couple's earlier laughter, their dismissive glances at staff, their exaggerated gestures, all of it now looked hollow when contrasted with the billionaire's calm declaration. The silence allowed everyone to process this shift, to reflect on the difference between borrowed power and genuine influence. It was not the kind of silence that made people uncomfortable, but the kind that carried a lesson, a quiet reminder of how quickly appearances can unravel when faced with undeniable truth. For the couple, the silence was unbearable. They shifted in their seats, their earlier confidence dissolving into awkward fidgeting. They avoided eye contact, their voices suddenly gone, their presence shrinking under the collective gaze of the room. What had been a stage for their arrogance was now a mirror exposing their insecurity. Their entitlement, which they believed gave them the right to claim the table, was revealed as nothing more than a fragile mask. They had mistaken arrogance for power, but true power does not need to seize it. Already belongs. The silence pressed this realization onto them more forcefully than any reprimand ever could. It was the weight of being exposed without confrontation, of being humbled, not through anger, but through truth. For the billionaire, the silence was not a tool of humiliation but a natural extension of his presence. He did not need to fill it with more words, because the weight of his statement already carried the authority of ownership. His calm expression, his steady posture, and his choice to let the silence linger demonstrated a kind of mastery that few possess. True power often resides in knowing when to speak and when to remain quiet. By choosing silence, he allowed the truth to breathe, to settle into the minds of everyone present. It wasn't just about reclaiming his table, it was about letting the moment reveal the difference between pretense and authenticity. His silence was not empty. It was filled with meaning, a quiet strength that resonated more deeply than any further explanation ever could. The room itself seemed to respond to this unspoken energy. The staff who had earlier hesitated to confront the couple now stood taller, reassured by the authority that had reasserted itself. Patrons who had watched the arrogance unfold now shared subtle glances, their expressions carrying both admiration for the billionaire's composure and a quiet satisfaction at seeing the couple humbled. The air was thick with recognition, the kind of recognition that doesn't need to be verbalized. It was as if the silence created a collective understanding that everyone in the room had just witnessed a truth about human behavior, how arrogance falters when faced with genuine authority, how noise is drowned out by calm presence, and how appearances can collapse in the face of authenticity. The couple's earlier attempts to command attention now worked against them. They had spoken loudly, gestured flamboyantly, and tried to dominate the atmosphere with their presence. Now, the silence turned all of those actions into echoes of embarrassment. What they had used to assert superiority became evidence of their emptiness. In contrast, the billionaire's quiet presence filled the room without effort. The silence made the difference stark. One side relied on performance, the other on reality. It was not just a lesson for the couple, but for everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that true influence requires no theatrics, no forced displays, no desperate grasping at validation. Silence can be louder than arrogance when it comes from a place of truth. As the seconds stretched on, the silence grew heavier for the couple. What had seemed like a bold move now felt like a spotlight exposing their weakness. They were trapped not by anger or confrontation, but by their own reflection in the stillness of the room. Every breath they took, every nervous glance, every awkward movement deepened their discomfort. They had nothing left to say, because anything they tried to add would only highlight their loss of control. In the face of ownership, their entitlement evaporated, leaving them with nothing but the awareness that they had overstepped into a space they did not belong. The silence forced them to sit in that realization, to feel the weight of it without a spata. Observers around them would remember the moment not because of drama but because of its simplicity. It was a scene that illustrated something timeless, that arrogance cannot sustain itself when stripped of illusion, and that genuine authority does not need to prove itself through noise. The silence that filled the room was not empty, but full of understanding, full of contrast, full of the unspoken acknowledgement that the billionaires.com words carried more force than any confrontation ever could. It was a silence that humbled arrogance and elevated authenticity, a silence that turned a moment of entitlement into a lasting lesson about the difference between appearing powerful and truly being powerful. The couple, though reduced in presence, became a symbol of that contrast, their silence speaking louder than their earlier noise. They had tried to claim a place that was not theirs, but in doing so, they revealed the limits of their bravado. The billionaire, without raising his voice or forcing their hand, showed that real authority is undeniable. The silence that followed his words made that truth resonate not just with them, but with every person in the room. It was the kind of silence that lingers, that stays with people long after the moment ends, reminding them of the profound power that lies in calm truth and the emptiness of arrogance when it is unmasked.